some joint big claims or anything like that. But as you'll notice, I mean, many of the things that Joel has spoken of will be repeated. But I gather from different, a little bit of a different, let's say, discourse, or with different tone and different spirit, probably also. And it's been, or it is, a continuous discussion going on between us and a few other colleagues to kind of find out and kind of push forward points of disagreement, which are not always so easy maybe to find or locate, or that they are that they're unclear where the disagreements are, and also points at which it's unclear whether or not we agree or don't agree, or look at things or understand things the same way. So that will be also kind of, that's a way of inviting you to be attentive also to possible tensions in what I will be saying in relation to Joel's presentation. As a kind of quick summary, or not a quick summary, but as a, let's say I'll put forth that my starting point is, in that sense, similar to Joel's, and maybe ending up in many ways to a similar point also. But I would also want to kind of stress that I think that that this question about who's afraid of love is exactly not a fear about not receiving love, but in a certain way, paradoxically, exactly a fear of love. And I would, I will try to say something about this, that there's a certain kind of, let's call it paradox, or a certain kind of unclarity here, maybe also, that I would say that our fear of love is somehow coupled to, or arises with, or is informed by, or underpinned by the strange fact that we somehow are fundamentally constituted in love, or in a certain way have already always received something which I will call unconditional love, and I'll try to say that. So and that's what makes it the fear of love somehow, paradoxically, possible. I think also, I mean, but I don't know if I'll have time to talk about this, but I had a certain kind of, well, it's a kind of an ongoing thing for me to kind of try to think through, that it also seems to me that there's a certain kind of paradox about calling it, which Joel also, I mean, pointed out in many at many times already in his talk, that there's something weird about this idea of fear here, because it's very unclear what it is about love, for instance, that we fear or do not fear. And one of my suggestions somehow is that I think that fear here, that the fear in fact functions as a kind of a defense barrier, let's call it like that. And my kind of putting it in simplistically would be something to say that it's a way of that fear in itself creates a certain kind of, let's say, emotional charge to the difficulty of love, and the fear in itself makes it somehow justified, the very escape of love, from love. And I'll be suggesting somehow that maybe the thing we are maybe not afraid of, but the difficulty of love has something to do with owning up to love, to this what I call unconditional love, which is not, I think, cannot really be described in terms of a fear, but that the fear exactly is somehow a certain kind of defense barrier made in order to deflect or to displace this truth about this difficulty of owning up to it. But let's see how far we get there, or how far I get there today, at least. Now, Joel started with a joke. I started with this, and then he went on to talk about Socrates and philosophy. And I thought that I would do something similar, but saying something in this sense that that I think that in philosophy, in the history of philosophy, generally and roughly put, of course, there is a way in which we can see a certain kind of, let's say, a hidden acknowledgement of love present in all of philosophy. Exactly now, love in this kind of as something constitutive about us, about our subjectivity, about our being or existence as such, and that can be found in this queer way in which I propose that philosophy is, that it comprises a three-step movement, by which I mean that philosophy in itself always follows or has its beginning in a certain form of disruption or departure. So, and I gather, and then the second step is it's, as it were, understanding or discovery. What philosophy discovers is always a form of rediscovery or recollection, and then you have a certain kind of notion of a return implied in all of philosophy. So now, I mean, the first step here that philosophy somehow begins with or is preconditioned on the notion of a disruption or departure, I think is, I mean, easy to understand. I mean, we get any question about, I mean, questions about truth or meaning or clarity, of course, somehow presupposes that we have somehow been separated from clarity, or reality or truth or understanding, that there's something we don't understand. And usually, of course, this can be portrayed as a certain kind of, as something in the ordinary, whatever that sphere of life is, that something in the ordinary becomes out of joint, somehow doesn't function, somehow raises a question. So we depart in that sense. There's a disruption and a departure. But the second step, I mean, my proposal that the discovery of philosophy is always a discovery or a rediscovery or recollection. And of course here you already have from Plato beginning the idea that all knowledge is recollection. But that I would say that that there is something in that sense present in all of philosophy, and I would say also that, I mean, of course, oversimplified, and there's a certain kind of violent generalization that I'm building on here, but that the understanding that philosophy discovers itself to seek, or maybe put that the understanding that answers to the very event of the disruption or departure is something that's always already there, embedded in the, let's say, in the words that we use, or in an understanding, or in the very conditions that structure our experience and the world for us. So in that sense, I mean, philosophy finds its most of clarity not in any new pieces of knowledge or new pieces of information as such, but in something that somehow always already was there. And I think that this is, in many ways, something which we can find already. I mean, Plato and Socrates, St. Augustine, we have it in Descartes, in Kant, in different ways. Phenomenology, I mean, that our questions is already there in the phenomenon itself, and the phenomenon is always something that's given, for instance, I mean, a very crude generalization, psychoanalysis in many ways. I'll come back to that, and Wittgenstein also, and these two latter will be somehow one of the main things that I'll be drawing on today. But the important thing here, I think that to the extent that we can say that this first step, let's say, call it the disruption or departure, can be said to constitute a certain form of alienation. So you somehow, the world, the everyday world feels somehow out of joint, you feel alienated from it in one sense of the word at least. I think that what must be observed or taken into account that this discovery as rediscovery or recollection is not something that, as it were, in a simple sense at least, undoes this alienation or this self or this notion of a certain kind of maybe not estrangement but separation, if we use that word. For rather that I think that the second step inaugurates a new form of or a new event of estrangement or separation. Exactly because the self-understanding, which in a sense would emerge from philosophy in its recollecting or rediscovering something which always already was there, implies a certain kind of redeeming or an owning up to the self-understanding, which is always that the self-understanding, this redeeming or this new discovery as a rediscovery always also is something where the subject or the individual takes up his or her place, his or her place in something that is both, in a certain sense, beyond the self also, in the sense of what I can understand, where I somehow is, and also prior to myself or to the self, exactly. So there's a certain kind of, there's no, as it were, simple return, so to speak. And this was by the third, that you have a certain moment of return that philosophy anticipates, at least. But how to understand that return hinges on how we understand what this rediscovery or recollection is. So I think that perhaps there's no better or more poetic picture of this, what I'm gaining at here, than the one we find in Plato's Theaetetus, where the picture is something in terms that the interlocutors, Socrates' interlocutors, the rational souls of the interlocutors is pictured as conceived into the world through or by the very words or from the very desire of the interlocutors themselves. So the soul is born, in a certain sense, from the very words or from the very desire that moves the interlocutor to speak, but in a certain sense conceived into the world through these. So the soul is somehow brought or conceived into the world, and where you have Socrates here, Socrates' love or his friendship, fulfilling the function of the midwife, so the one that, as it were, helps the soul to come into the world in the ways in which exactly Socrates' words somehow disrupt the interlocutor's self-understanding, and by that disruption exactly brings to the world their true self-understanding, if you want to put it like that. Or alternatively, perhaps there's no better or more poetic formulation or even formalization of this logic than we have in Freud's "Wo es war, soll ich werde," which is translated more or less that where it was, I have to become, or that is my destiny to become. And we'll come back to this. But this is, so this is the way in which I maybe want to frame my part of this talk. All right. Now, I thought that in order and this will be in many ways a certain kind of, let's say, a continuation. Joel said that he in the end of his part, he was talking about making the distinction between two kinds of love. So on the one hand, a love that is somehow always already there, something which is internal to that, the very way in which we somehow are constituted already in the world. And then on the other hand, a love which is maybe an owning up to. So this is basically the same thing that I will be talking about, but I will try to, my route, or as proposed to go, or as it were, to account for this or to describe it by starting with Ludwig Wittgenstein, who don't know how familiar he is, but Wittgenstein as a name, whether or not he's familiar or not, is conceived to be one of the great philosophers of all time, at least the great philosophers of the 20th century. And I want to kind of give a kind of very rough sketch of what I take to be maybe the prime drive and the most important, the pinnacle of his later philosophy, and specifically how it's articulated in his philosophical investigations, which is one of his central works. My point, I would want to start off by saying that well, yeah, maybe I'll start in this way in order to come into Wittgenstein, to say that, of course, I mean, there's a certain kind of way in which what I'm now kind of searching for, this unconditional love, this form of love which is somehow there as a constitutive element for us, that's, of course, in many ways signals or points to that what we're in search of here is a notion of origin. And this is why I want to take in that, or say that I think that an investigation into origin is somehow always required or goes through ideas of primal scenes, or maybe rather primal mythologies. And on that note, I think I want to also introduce the way in which Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations opens up with a kind of a primal scene or a primal mythology of the origins, in certain ways, of language or meaning. And he begins it by borrowing or quoting St. Augustine from his Confessions. And you will see that it is exactly a kind of a scene that he depicts. And then I'll continue there, but I'll read it out, the opening scene from Augustine. And it goes like this. When they, that is to say, Augustine's elders, his parents, named some object and accordingly moved towards something, I saw this and grasped that the thing was called by the sound they uttered when they meant to point it out. Their intentions were shown by the bodily movements as if it were the natural language of all people, the expressions of the face, the play of the eyes, the movement of other parts of the body, and the tone of voice which expresses our state of mind in seeking, having, rejecting, or avoiding something. Thus, as I heard words repeatedly used in their proper places in various sentences, I gradually learned to understand what objects they signified, and after I had trained my mouth to form these signs, I used them to express my own desires. So this is Augustine's, as it were, or Wittgenstein placing this description that Augustine has as a kind of a primal scene or an opening scene of the investigations of the work in itself, but also a kind of as a primal scene or mythology of the origins of language and meaning. and, should I say, subjectivity, of course, at the same point. So I want to draw attention now to, firstly, to two central elements that we have in this mythology or this scene. And the first of them is what in philosophy, since Hegel, has become known as the other, so to speak, the other of language. And of course, I mean, in the scene you have the infant Augustine there, somehow trying to as it were, being taught language. And that's, of course, something which happens all the time. We're not born into this world with a ready-made language, so we just start speaking. No, we get it from someone else. Somebody teaches us language. And so the scene itself, I mean, already implies, or the mythology implies, that in order to say something, that is, say, in order to exist as somehow a meaningful or a subject of signifiers, that is, say, someone that says something, and in that sense, and that in order to be able to articulate oneself as a subject of these signifiers, instead of simply, as it were, being described by the other as being this and this kind of subject. So in order for me to stand on the scene of meaning, the infant needs somehow to follow the authority of the other. So in this case, the other has certain rules, so you use this word for chair and not some other words, and then you use it in these and all different kind of ways. So you have a certain idea that the other provides, as it were, the rules, the criteria for how things are to be named, and also, of course, about what it is when I say something about myself, I also have to apply to the criteria and the rules of the other. Now, so this is one element. We have the other there, and then the investigations, I won't go into it now, but I'm just kind of, you take my word for it, that the investigations, in that sense, famously is known for showing that the language of the other, in many ways, runs up to this paradox. And the paradox consists of two different things. Now, the first thing is, of course, that, well, the parents here are, as it were, the guardians of the language of the other. They teach because they already know. But in relation to the rules of language, they, of course, are, in a certain sense, in the same position as the infant, because they also have to, as it were, have inherited the language. They must have learned the rules of language and so on. So in that sense, it's the parents, as it were, it's not they that have created this language. And then the questions arises then, well, if we have something, if meaning is supposed to somehow, let's say, be the sovereign property of the other, then it seems to be, and if those are governed by somehow rules, criteria, then it seems to be that we get into this question, and Wittgenstein is in brilliant ways brings this out throughout the investigations, that, well, if it's like this, then what would be the rule for how to follow rules as such? What would be the thing that says to us how we should, as it were, follow rules as such? If there are rules, for instance, I'm pointing ostensive definition, I say chair. So and then I give a certain rule. So this is called chair, and then I say this is called name tag, whatever it is, computer, and so on. And then, of course, we have a more elaborate ways in how the grammar then unfolds. But in all of these very simple cases, I'm already asking, well, what would be the rule for me to understand that when I point here, that I should follow exactly this? And so the problem here is always that there's a certain, any idea of a rule-based governed language already presupposes what is supposed to, in a certain way, describe. So there we have the first element, and this comes in conflict then, of course, with the second element of this primal seed, this ursen, which is the individual. The individual has desires that they want to somehow articulate. They want to position themselves as saying these and these things, expressing these and these things, being someone that's, let's say, recognized not simply as determined by the other, but someone who says something. Now, and these somehow come into conflict because it's not very clear, well, how is it supposed to be then that the individual here has any authority at all? So how can my desire, what I feel, how can that be, as it were, carried by the language of the other? And so here you have a very classical, I mean, this is the subject-object thing that Joel was speaking about in that sense, or the internal, external. So we have in the philosophy of language, of course, is especially in the analytical philosophy of language, this idea of the externalist or internalist notions of meaning. So meaning is only what, as it were, is governed by the external rules, or then meaning is what somehow is my intentions. When I say I'm hungry, then it means that meaning is somehow fixed inside of me, in my own subjectivity. Now then the investigations, these two perspectives of the primal scene, meet up and try to decide where does really meaning exist here, and there's really if the idea of the other or language as governed by rules comes into this paradox of the rule following paradox, then the internalist perspective comes into contradiction in what is famously known as the private language argument, where you have this idea that, well, if meaning can't be constituted, it doesn't get, as it were, off the ground simply by having the rule of the other, then what if meaning simply is, and this is Wittgenstein's proposal here, that we have that language or meaning would be something which the meaning of a word or a signifier is it is the sensation that I have, the inner, as it were, sensation that I have. If we would have that kind of language, then we don't need rules, because if I say, for instance, pain, then pain means whatever I have, as it were, the sensation itself. So there's no need for rules. I mean, this is the fantasy, this is the proposal that's put forth. And then through elaborate discussions in the investigations, then we kind of see that the field of the other, so to speak, if the point would be that you would get meaning without the problem of rule following by, as it were, cutting loose the field of the other from this, if you have the primal scene. So you get rid of the other, and there's simply just the sensations, the private inner things and subjectivity of the individual, and meaning is supposed to be located there, then we see that there's really no way in which the field of the other is possible to cut loose in the fantasy in itself. And I'll come later to this, but the point here is that it's unable to be cut loose exactly to the extent that speaking and language is tied to desire, and specifically to the desire to say something to someone else. But of course, if there's no point, if language is never supposed to be about saying something to someone else, then of course, meaning you don't need, as it were, any rules. You don't need the other at all, because you're never going to say anything, and nobody would know anything or have ever heard about any of the private sensations. But of course, to the extent that language is intertwined with desire, then Wittgenstein quite brilliantly shows that whatever inner object, as it were, the inner object which was supposed to stand for meaning in itself, doesn't really have, it's irrelevant. It has no effect in our discussions with each other. It can have no relevance. So that which was supposed to be the most relevant thing, we would say, the inner object, my private sensation, is completely irrelevant if there is a desire to speak, if language is supposed to somehow be connected to the other.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah.
The last thought?
The last thought was that to the extent that maybe this was that the thing that was supposed to be the most precious, the most value, I mean, the essence of meaning, when you, as it were, discover that language is tied to desire, that there's someone to speak with. I mean, otherwise you wouldn't speak. Why would you speak to yourself? You just have your sensations. But language is, in that sense, always shown to be connected to desire, which means to say something to someone else. And then the inner object is completely irrelevant, because it has no place, because the whole point was to cut loose the field of the other, cut the other away from meaning. So in that sense, there's a certain kind of, it's not that we see a certain kind of, let's say, logical impossibility here. We see simply that we cannot separate language from desire, and desire from the desire of desire for the other, as it were. So this would be the crux of, this is my interpretation, of the private language argument, roughly put. No, so then we have our mythology of language, presented by Wittgenstein through Augustine, and the two elements. The two elements, neither one of them by themselves is able to really account for meaning, or subjectivity for that matter, but neither are they able to do it together either. So there's a certain kind of bizarre, as it were, short circuit in this scene as such. Now, of course, the weird thing is that something like this obviously goes on. I mean, there's an infant and we say things. So it's not that the scene in itself is somehow wrong, but to the extent philosophy somehow tries to account for meaning exactly in this way in which you have, let's call it the subjective and the objective main frameworks, then nothing, you can never account for meaning. And I think that the problem here is exactly that to the extent we get fixated on these two elements, what we do is that it's a very clear repression going on here. Something we repress from the primal scene itself, which is repressed exactly because what is repressed there gives us nothing, and in a certain sense makes it impossible for us to account for language in terms of exactly explaining the origins of meaning, explaining origins of subjectivity, making it into an object of knowledge in that sense. So then I propose we enter the third element, which is the repressed element, which is, I mean, very simple, nothing particularly weird. And if we go back to the scene, well, I can quote the beginning of a scene just to refresh your memory. It started out with, when they, that's my parents, named some object and accordingly moved towards something, I saw this and I grasped that the thing was called by the sound they uttered when they meant to point it out. So this was the ostensive definition. But of course, the quote continues with this passage. Their intentions were shown by their bodily movements, as if it were the natural language of all peoples. The expression of the face, the play of the eyes, the movements of the other parts of the body, and the tone of the voice which expresses our states of mind in seeking, having, rejecting, avoiding, or something. Now, of course, just a little bit later on in the investigations, Wittgenstein comes up with this statement, or a certain voice in the investigations comes up with this voice. And now quoting Wittgenstein, I think we can say, Augustine describes the learning of human language as if the child came into a strange country and did not understand the language of the country. That is, as if it already had a language, only not this one. Now, of course, this is exactly what the Augustinian primal scene exactly does depict. However, and I think this is the crucial point, nowhere throughout the investigation is this point of the givenness of language overcome or explained away. Instead, we find in investigations all kinds of passages when Wittgenstein says something like, well, explanations come to an end somewhere, or at some point we just simply have to say, well, this is how we do, and so on. So, so in that sense, there's no, as it were, overcoming of this aspect as part of the mythology in itself, of the primal scene. Now, and here I start coming to the end of my point in Wittgenstein is that I think that what we get here is that, well, in order for these two first elements, the field of the other and this and the subjective, as it were, to function at all, we need already to presuppose language. Language is already there in the mythology, in the primal scene of language and meaning. So we have there, in this sense, a peculiar kind of mythology of origin, or that all mythologies of origin or scenes of origin have this, that there's a certain kind of unbridgeable gap, as it were, between the subject and the object, or between the signifier and the signified, is, in that sense, paradoxically, I mean, the gap in itself is paradoxically rooted in a certain kind of understanding and meaningfulness that is already there, embedded in the very way in which we are, in that sense, inescapably addressed by each other. So, of course, the scene that you have in all mythologies of scenes of language and meaning, you always already presuppose that there is someone there that addresses, somebody says something to someone else. And the point is that that is not, and already that in itself means, and this is, I think, Wittgenstein's point, that you have already, in order for get the most simplest and basic elements of meaning to function, let's say ostensive definitions, you already have to understand. So when I point at the chair and say chair, you have to somehow mysteriously already, for the first, be addressed by me, and I by you, as someone that is saying something at all, and then also in a certain way have a certain understanding, and we already have a certain understanding and sharing of a certain meaningfulness that we cannot account for as an explanation of that. I mean, of course, the issue is here a little bit more complex because, of course, then you can say, well, let's go to natural science and evolutionary theory. My quick answer to that would be, well, all of those theories are already presupposing language in itself, and they cannot. But this is a more complex question. We'll leave that. I mean, we can come back to and discuss that. But anyway, so this would be, as it were, my first step. I'm checking the time. Okay, so I'll go on about half an hour, and then we'll take a break, and the rest of the things I'm going to continue saying in the afternoon later on, what I'm going to say. But I want to move on now to Jacques Lacan, psychoanalyst notoriously known for his unorthodox psychoanalytic practices, but also his theories. And I want to see this as a kind of I mean, many will say that I'm going to do violence to Lacan, and perhaps that's true, but to the extent it's true because violence needs to be done to Lacan in order to get it. But I'm going to use it simply also because I have had and have a certain kind of interest for him, and I think there's interesting ways in which his writings can make things accessible to us, a certain kind of paradoxes, at least. So we have the scene from Wittgenstein that somehow the mythologies or primal scenes of language and subjectivity already, as it were, presuppose what any explanation or any forms of knowledge of that would require. So so I want to, as it were, juxtapose that with a very short one-liner from Lacan's Seminar 23, the symptom, in which we find the following sentence. This is not the whole sentence, but I've left something away. But anyway, it reads like this: every single subject in analysis reveals how he or she is always and only ever a supposition. Now, so first, of course, we need to pay attention to this idea of the supposition. Specifically, and here it's important to read Lacan as one of Lacan's major, as it were, projects is, in a certain sense, a movement against epistemology or against philosophy in its primordially, as Lacan usually sees it, in its epistemic, as it were, foundation, and here specifically Descartes, philosophy and Descartes, that epistemology is, as it were, the first form of philosophy, or the first philosophy. So the point here is that, well, people come to analysis and find out, or presupposition, people come to analysis in order to find out or to know what he or she really is, what is this problem, and who am I? So this is, as it were, Lacan's point that everyone comes to, in that sense, to analysis with these kinds of problems. And yet, the unconscious here reveals the absence of exactly this object of knowledge. That is to say, reveals the absence of any he calls it substance of the self. And this is what I want to discuss, and from there on come to my notions of love as unconditionally constituting us. And Lacan's point here is, in many ways similar to Wittgenstein's, that exactly this failure of epistemology, or the failure or the absence of this substance or object of knowledge that psychoanalysis reveals leads us to discover the I, or subjectivity, in desire, or as fundamentally intertwined with, or in a certain sense constituted in or through desire. Another notorious phrase from Lacan would be, there are many, but one of them would be to say that one of his definitions of the subject is that the subject is the effect of the signifier as such. So this is what I want to take note on now. So if I put it this way, and simplifying, of course, Lacan here, but something like this, that, well, we are, of course, always the subjects of what I will now call determinate signifiers. So, for instance, determinate signifiers mean simply, well, for instance, chair or whatever. So signifiers with that have a not determinate meaning in certain sense that it's you can't verify that it's a name of an object, but determinate in the sense that there's a field of language in which whatever usage that you make of a certain signifier will be in relation to that, as it were, grammar of the concept in itself. So that would be the determinate. So the subject is always a subject of determinate signifiers. So, for instance, I'm, whatever I would be a subject of. I'm screaming, I'm happy, or whatever. Of course, and I will be the subject of those signifiers, which are determinate signifiers. No, but however, as we already pointed out many times, each such recognition of the other, of course, as being a subject of whatever signifiers they are, presupposes what we have called already the address as such, which in Lacan's terminology would be to say something like that every instance of a recognition of a subject of determinate signifiers presupposes already that someone has been recognized as the signifier, as the subject of the signifier as such. So in that sense, and Lacan builds a very eloquent theory around this, which we won't go into. I'll just kind of pick out the main points here. No, in order just, simplify this, would be to say something like this, that, well, let's take, for instance, the baby comes out of is born, and it screams. So, of course, we already take it, before we know whatever that scream might be, what its determinate, as it were, signifier would be, we already take it as someone that is screaming. So that scream already addresses us as such, in the same way as even when the baby kicks the fetus kicks in the stomach, we already take that the fetus in itself to be a subject of whatever signifier we have. And of course, this extends to all kinds of things. We take animals already to be subjects of signifiers as such. We are basically everything that in ways, one way or another, addresses us, already somehow addresses us as subjects in certain ways, or signifiers. But these are, the term of subjectivity here, of course, needs a certain kind of way in which that subject somehow will be able to redeem or claim its subjectivity. So in that sense, you might also say, and we'll come back to this, but that's why you might also say that animals are not subjects, because they're unable to redeem their position or claim their position as these subjects. But we'll come back to that. Now, certainly, there's a certain kind of, Lacan always has this notion of retroversion going on here. So, of course, it's true that there's no possibility of a recognition of the subject of the signifier as such to be singled out independently, as it were, of any determinate signifiers. There's no expression, there's no way in which the other is addressed without, as it were, exactly these expressions that we come with. So in that sense, one might say that we as subjects, as such, are never, as such, we never become, we cannot be elevated to the level of phenomena or existence. If you're familiar with or have heard about Emmanuel Levinas has this idea that there's which is basically the same idea that you have, that the face of the other is something that unconditionally will address you, but there's nothing, the face in itself is not a specific phenomena in itself, in its address. It's something that is somehow other than being, or somehow, in that sense, a certain kind of transcendental moment. but not transcendental as being an object somewhere else, but in a certain sense always somehow embedded or constitutive of the very face in itself, but not any specific phenomena. So we cannot pinpoint what the face is, what the address in itself is. Now, so in that sense, the thing in itself, what makes me me, that is to say, what it is about me that as such addresses you, is something that in a certain sense evades or drops out. I mean, these are biased concepts, but I'm using them. They're misleading in many ways, I think, but I'll use them because I'm kind of orienting myself through Lacan here, that they always evade or drop out from any representation, that is to say, from any signifiers as such, which means that our subjectivity as such, that which addresses others, can never be reconciled with, they can never be, as it were, fused with identity. Because identity is always an identity, so I am this or that, and that would be a specific formulation, an articulation or representation, which I would then somehow identify with. So in that sense, our subjectivity as such is something which is not maybe opposite to identity, but which identity can never really per default achieve, which maybe might say something important about discourses going on today around identity in many ways. Now, well, yeah, here is, in fact. So I'll just, Lacan is, I mean, I'm putting this because if you ever get interested in Lacan, then you'll get, I'm making a certain kind of, I'm just showing you how he has these diagrams always. So this is the way in which Lacan, this is a modification of his, but Lacan has these 4 discourses, and the basic elements, the master signifier, which in the context that we're now talking about would be something like, well, the subject of the signifier as such addresses signifier 2, which would be, in that sense, the other's response. So this gets its meaning in relation always through in the way in which it's responded. Now, the point is that every response from the other will, as it were, every recognition that the other says, how they recognize me as always and necessarily also a subject of determinate signifiers, will always be divided by what Lacan calls object petit a, so the small object A, which Lacan calls the object cause of desire. And we'll come back to that. And that, in that sense, so it would be something like this. So the object petit a is something that, as it were, affects the master signifier, and that's why the master signifier will be divided. So the subject is a divided or barred or decentered subjectivity, because it always lacks in terms of identity, in terms of consciousness, it always lacks, as it were, in the answer of the other, from the response of the other, it always lacks object petit a, or divided by it. I think Lacan is wrong on this point, but I'll come back to why that is. But I think he's right exactly to the extent we take this as a kind of antithesis to the notion of identity as being the core of subjectivity. What did I say? When did I say we have to stop? Well, I'll go on I'll do the Lacan bit at least finished, and then we can break for lunch. So let me just So the object cause. I mean, the object cause here, of course, is nothing else than exactly that, well, in this fundamental sense in which we are addressed by each other as subjects of signifiers as such. Of course, there's nothing, for the first, I mean, I don't know what it is about me that addresses you as such. That's why I go to an analysis. I mean, that would be one. So I go there in order to understand what that was and what am I. But neither does the other person know. Because we're in that sense both in the same position. Both are simply, let's say, thrown into the world, to use Heidegger's terms, or we just find ourselves as beings that are addressed already, which is another way of maybe saying that we don't constitute ourselves. I mean, that it's we don't create ourselves ex nihilo, and in that sense, we presuppose God, or God becomes, in that sense, the one that creates ex nihilo, from nothingness. That is not our lot, so to speak. Now, so the object cause in this sense is exactly the point, is that which somehow causes us to be addressed by others. So of course, and this you might say is a certain kind of, I mean, this is of course a certain kind of metaphysical language or ontological language, but and specifically epistemological language. So there's something, we know somehow we are addressed, and something causes it. We have no idea, and not only do we not have any idea, but there's no access for knowledge to explain or account for what this object cause is. And this is why desire, in that sense, why subjectivity, according to Lacan, I think rightly, is in a certain sense constituted in or as desire in itself. Because whatever that object cause is, the only way, as it were, the only place where it could be is exactly in the other's desire. So what is it, I mean, whatever it is about me that causes you to be addressed as such, somehow that cause is somehow internal to the other's desire. There's, you know, when you look at me, what it is that fundamentally addresses you is somehow in your desire because you are addressed. So that would be Lacan's point. So in that sense, let's say that the subjects, so in that sense, my desire, to the extent we have here a desire in terms of what Lacan would say, a kind of desire to know, or desire as something which is not there, which is lacking, and in the sense that that is, in Lacan's perception, exactly something which is the cause, the substance of me, which addresses you, then that is somehow completely and internal to your desire. So my desire is, in a certain way, the other's desire. So your desire is, in a certain sense, my desire is defined by your desire, because I am, as it were, completely not just dependent on your desire, but I'm in a certain way internal to the other's desire. And of course, that goes the same way, because I'm in the also the I is, of course, also in the position of the you just as much as the other. So so that's, of course, an important part of this picture. Now, I think I'll just say shortly here that the problem, in that sense, to the extent there's a problem with Lacan and a problem with this, is that it's as if, I mean, in that sense, this, you could say that this idea that he has here, exactly, and Lacan has this idea that subjectivity is fundamentally hysterical. And by hysterical, he means exactly that our subjectivity are pursuits of knowledge, the hysterical. we always ask what it is about us that the other one is addressed. So I'm kind of hysterically always trying to find out what this object petit a is. And in that sense, he would also say that all human forms of knowledge is paranoid knowledge. That is to say that there's somebody that is supposed to know, that's the paranoid, somebody that's supposed to know what this object petit a is. And in that sense, it's ultimately, of course, it's the big other in Lacan's terminology that is supposed to know what is this cause. Now, and I think that one of the fundamental problems that you find both in Lacanian theory and also in things like the theory of recognition, which is basically comes from this Hegelian tradition and found in a lot of critical theory and things like that, seems to be that it seems to take this notion that what we long for and what is impossible for us to achieve is recognition, an unconditional recognition, an unconditional, as it were, acknowledgement of us as subjects, as subjects as such. Because everything you say to me will, in that sense, always, according to these theories, somehow match up with determinate signifiers or identity. I am this, which you always address, and there's always something that drops out from that. I mean, this is the notion, and then that's why, for instance, Honne, the idea is that that's what moral progress is. We just expand, as it were, our needs and want to have recognition more and more. And all of that is kind of based on the idea that there's a certain kind of laws and for Lacan, fundamental laws of recognition. And the idea is that, for instance, that in the phantasmatic mode, that in the beginning, that is to say, in our infancy, we had more or less unconditional love with the mother, or before that we were inside the mother, so there was a fundamental unity, as it were, no separation, no distinction between, and no need for recognition. And then comes this violent event of stepping into existence. We have separation and all of that, and then we long to go back to this because existence doesn't really allow for a fundamental recognition or acknowledgement. Lacan's point is here, of course, that any such idea or notion or striving is fundamentally a phantasmatic striving, because there was never a point of fundamental unity. Lacan's point is rather that there's something about subjectivity, about a difficulty with subjectivity that, as it were, creates this fantasy of a longing back to an unseparated unity, which is, of course, in certain sense, a death drive. That is to say, to get rid of who you are, your own subjectivity, which presupposes exactly the separation. And you could say that Lacan's point would be, you could say it like this, that to the extent it is a desire or a fantasy of the subject in itself, it exactly is a fantasy, because the subjectivity cannot, as it were, think of itself outside of itself. And exactly the pure unity would be to think itself outside of itself. Well, that can be discussed, of course, but so my critical point here would be that to the extent that there's this kind of idea that what is most troubling for subjectivity, why we go to analysis and such, is that there's also always a kind of a impossibility in our fantasies of achieving pure unconditional recognition or love, because and Lacan's point is exactly because all of the specific signifiers will always be partial. It will never be fully. So for instance, you can never touch someone completely. There's always something that is lacking in that touch. But we have this kind of fantasy of being fully embraced, touched fully, that is, say, acknowledged as a pure object. And Lacan has this, the idea of the mirror stage, the imaginary as this, that the psyche is constructed around this idea of the unitary object, which is the object of the other's desire, but we don't need to go. But that's never realized. And that's why we go to analysis and find out that, well, we are only a supposition. But I would say that the point Joel has been making, and I think you found also me making, in a certain sense, already in the Wittgenstein example, and also, as it were, lurking all the time in Lacan, is exactly that. I think that what is troubling here is not that we cannot ever achieve, or it's an impossibility to achieve this unconditional recognition, but rather exactly the opposite, namely that fundamental, or in that sense, unconditional recognition, unconditional exactly because there's nothing, we don't choose it, there's no conditions under which I choose to acknowledge you as someone, a subject as such. It's completely unconditional. There's no control. There's nothing I can do about it. So the problem is exactly not that we lack it and fundamentally lack it and it's impossible to achieve, but rather exactly the opposite, namely that is something which we cannot not receive. It's something which cannot be denied us at all. And that's, as it were, my proposal for what, in that sense, stands as the kind of fundamental troubling thing about love. Or it's exactly not that we haven't gotten it, but rather that we somehow are always already in it and cannot escape it. And that's why we want to escape it. But the twist I want to kind of bring in here is exactly this, the notion of owning up to or redeeming subjectivity, that to say, redeeming this love that we are, as it were, unconditionally, both receiving and the deliverers of. But I think I'll stop now and then say this. So I have two things more to say. The one is about this redeeming thing. I'll sum it up later today. And the other one is then I want to reflect on this relation between love and normativity, or discourse, ethics as a discourse, and its, as it were, impasse or deadlock in relation, or its, as it were, fundamental gap between love and normativity. So that is for the afternoon, later for the afternoon. So I'll stop here now and